he addressed here. What did you start to say something, Roger?
Yeah, the first thing he did there was he reasoned with the Jews in the synagogue.
Okay.
And then the devout person in the marketplace every day with those who happen to be there, the Epicureans and the Greek Stoics.
Okay. All right. So, first of all, I know I said this last week, but I want us to be impressed with the fact that Paul has the ability to speak with equal facility to whatever group he happens to be discussing things with. And the first thing that we come up with is that he was reasoning, as was his usual practice. It says that he was reasoning with them in the synagogue. And again, this is a word that we get dialogue from, dialegomai, mahi, I guess is how you pronounce it. Discuss, reason, debate, argue, converse. And I assume that in the synagogue is going to happen when? On the Sabbath. On the Sabbath day. And in the synagogue he found two groups. He found the Jews and in the Greek it's sebomahi, literally those worshiping there, and that would refer to proselytes. So in the synagogue, he's got Jews and proselytes of the gate, or God-fearing Greeks. Luke uses a number of terms to describe them for us. And what was his advantage with that group? Roger?
They had the same word. They were using Scripture
Okay.
to debate.
So he could use the Old Testament scriptures, and they would be familiar with that. He could lay down the promise that was made about the Messiah and lay right beside it the fulfillment of that, and in essence telling them the story of Jesus as he had done in every other synagogue he's been in, and identifying the fact that Jesus was the Messiah, because that's the person they were looking for. That's the promise they were looking for. Interestingly enough, we are not told about any success. Usually he would read that and he said, and many of the Jews, or a lot of the Greek women or Greek men, he's always told us that. Luke doesn't tell us anything about his success or failure with these. I would assume that he had some. And that's not his, right now in this particular chapter, that's not where his emphasis is. Next, he took his message to the marketplace. And when did he do that? Yeah, on a daily basis. So he's not having to wait for any particular day for that. This is called the Agora, the market. And it was the Agora was the center of public life. I mean, everything happened in the Agora. There's going to be buyers there. There's going to be sellers there of all kinds. It was a meeting place for people to gather. It was a common area. And we have seen already some of the people that are in the market regularly are not all that nice. They're the market loafers. Remember that the Jews hired to try to run Paul and Silas out of town, and were able to do that. Do any of you know what agoraphobia is? Or agoraphobia?
Fear of the marketplace?
Well, that's close. It's fear of crowds. There are people that are agoraphobic. They don't like to be in crowds. Well, does that give you an indication of the agora being crowded? There were people all of the time in there. And that's what it was. So here is a map again of Athens at the time. And here is the Agora, and that's this place right here. That's the remnants of the Agora. This is the temple of Hephaestus, and it's got quite the colonnade and everything there, but it's still standing. So you have those. The Agora was just in the shadow of the temple of Hephaestus. And I assume, as I'm looking at this, that picture that's on the right there would have been taken from the site of Mars Hill, looking down at the oops. Here we go. And this would be Mars Hill right here, where that red thing is. Now, who does Luke tell us that he is dialoguing with here? People that just happen to be there. Okay, it's if you want me, I'll spell it for you. The Greek word is P-A-R-A, para, and then T-U-G, tug, and then chano, C-H-A-N-O. It's paraunkono is how it's pronounced. I don't know why every time I say something in Greek it sounds Spanish, but I'm sure that's what it is. So he's there with anyone he chanced to meet. Does that remind you of anything? Exactly right. We were in a marketplace in this huge auditorium where there was people that were buying and selling and people that just happened to be by there. And so we are doing, at the fair, we were doing the same thing that Paul is doing here in Agora. And again, this was not on the Sabbath, this was on a daily basis, and we were there on a daily basis. I mean, as I was studying this, I thought, wow, we just did this. This is great. So also in the Agora were who else? Philosophers. And the Epicureans and the Stoics. And again, Paul could talk with them too. He could talk with just a person walking by. He could talk to the Jews and the proselytes over here, or philosophers coming through. If you go over to 1 Corinthians, the 9th chapter, and I'm not going to read the whole text here, but in verses 19 through 23, Paul said, "For though I'm free from all, I've made myself a servant of all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews he became a Jew, to win Jews. To those under the law, he became as one under the law." There would be like the proselytes there. To those outside the law, that would be the people in the marketplace, I became as one outside the law, not being there. So to the weak I became weak, to win the weak I became strong to the strong. He's just able to adapt himself to whatever audience is presented before him. So the next question, any other comments on number 10? Identify the following groups of people and tell what they believed. And before we get to the specifics, we already saw that he had dialogue with anyone he chanced to meet. Those daily interactions began, I think, probably to start attracting more people. Hey, have you heard that? Have you seen that guy in the Agora who's talking to everybody? He's teaching some very strange things, and so people start gathering around that. And then now you have, namely, professional philosophers of the two main schools of philosophy, both of which, by the way, were founded in Athens. Epicurean and Stoic philosophies were also taught in Roman school systems throughout the empire. It's a well-known philosophy. But a different word than dialoguing is used here. My translation has some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers also conversed with him. Do some of you have a different word than that? What? Encountered? Is that what you have, Cindy? Okay. Well, and that's kind of interesting, because the Greek word for that is sumbalo, B-A-L-L-O ends it, S-U-M-B-A-L-L-O, and whenever you see B-A-L-L-O, what do you think of? If I say parabol, what's a parable? You're throwing something up beside, and this is sumbalo. And so actually it says they kept throwing at him words and statements. So they're throwing, well, how can that be? Or tell me about this. And it's almost like he's being barraged with questions. And so they kept engaging him in these discussions. They kept deliberating with him. They kept up these encounters on a daily basis. And so now the philosophers have come in, and listen, all that's going to do is create more crowds, because they're wanting to know what's going on. And as the crowds grew, because this would have been interesting and what Paul was saying was new, you just have to imagine Paul is creating quite a stir in Athens. And again, he did this by adapting himself to their way of doing things. And so again, you first have the gathering circles of hearers in the agora, then you enter into public discussions with the philosophers. And as I'm looking at this, they also conversed with him, and some said, what does this babbler wish to say? Others said, he seems to be preaching foreign divinities because he's preaching Jesus and the resurrection. And I don't think that these discussions may have been heated, but I think they were still friendly because they're interested. And I think Paul would probably feel, well, at least these aren't Jewish fanatics and they're trying to kill me or run me out of town. I mean, they're showing interest in what he has to say. So we have these two contemporary but rival philosophical systems here. But both of these systems are very much interested in everyday life. It wasn't something weird. So, what did you find out about Epicureans? Paul?
Teaching of ancient Greek philosophy started by Epicurus,
Okay.
and the main thought was the greatest good is to seek modest pleasures that will gain tranquility, free of fear, and the absence of bodily pain.
Okay. All right, so that's true. They were followers of Epicurus. Epicurus lived, by the way, in 342 to 270 BC. Epicureans literally means philosophers of the garden. Because Epicurus owned a garden, and that's where he went to teach, and people would come to him to teach, be taught in his garden in Athens there. If you want to have a Jewish equivalent of Epicureans, it would be the Sadducees. Sadducees would be the equivalent kind of way of looking at life as the Epicureans did. The Epicureans taught that the gods were careless of mankind. They were phantoms that didn't have any real influence on mankind. They were, and so again, the Sadducees, they didn't believe in angels or demons or spirits or any of that. The Epicureans were sensualists. They were considered really by most Greek cultures to be atheistic by the people of their time, because when you died, as far as they were concerned, you were dead all over. So it's very much like the Sadducees. Stoics, anybody find anything else about Stoics? I know Paul did. Okay, Debbie, go ahead.
They should live according to nature, look at their own insufficiency, sin, and for self-desires.
Okay. Do you have anything else to add to that, Paul?
All is neither good or bad, and no social importance with respect to relationships to one another.
Okay. So this is this was founded by a man by the name of Zenon. He died in 265 BC, and the philosophy was really brought to its completion by a man named Chrysippus, which would be around 240. So they are in Athens. Zeno and Epicurus are in Athens at the same time, in the same time in history. And they literally are philosophers of the porch, because Zeno held forth in the Stoa, in the porch of Poikile, a painted porch in Athens. Let's see if I thought I had a picture of that. I probably did not. It's supposed to be slide 13 and it's not on there, so I think maybe my flash drive has that on there. They were pantheists. Anybody know what a pantheist is? That's polytheistic. But you're close. I mean, you're getting really close. Pantheism. If you remember the airline called Pan Am, where did they fly? Everywhere. Everywhere in the Americas. That's what pan means. And so pantheist means God is everywhere. God's in everything. He's everywhere. The world is the body of God, and God is the soul of the world. And so he's in every rock, tree, and plant, if you're a pantheist. And the pantheists were impassive, they were austere, and really they would be, if you want the Jewish equivalent of them, they would be the Pharisees of Greek philosophy. Pleasure was not good, punishment was not evil. And interestingly enough, when a Stoic saw no more reason to live, he just committed suicide. There was just no more reason. So any questions on that? So you have these two rival philosophies, and one's asking this question and one's asking another, but they're coming from completely different points of view. You can only imagine. Paul said, just a second, I'll answer your question. Let me take care of this one first. So what is their opinion of Paul, and what was it based on? We have two reactions given to us here. Yes?
That he was a babbler, and also he was for a strange god.
Okay. So the first one is kind of insulting. What is this babbler trying to say? And really the word babbler, do anybody else have a different word than that? Do you have anything in your footnotes or? Pardon me? Seed picker? Yeah, a seed picker. And actually the Greek word is spermologos. And it means seed, and you put those two words together, seed and word. But it's Athenian slang, and it really did mean a seed picker. So it first had reference to seed eating and scavenging birds that would just pick up whatever food they could anywhere they could. We call them crows today. They'll be anywhere getting anything that they can. And then from birds to humans, it became those who were vagrants and beggars, who were just trying to get whatever they could from other people, living off of scraps, picking up whatever was edible in the gutters, which is, again, you come into British time, and you had urchin children are called gutter snipes. A snipe is a bird, and so gutter snipes were, people that would just pick up whatever they could eat whenever they could. And then finally it came to be referred to teachers who didn't have an original idea. They would take a little bit of this philosophy and a little bit of this philosophy and a little bit of this, and then they would put it all together and they present it like it was new, and it wasn't. It was just a patchwork of old stuff. And so they're picking scraps of knowledge here and there. That's why if you look at the Jerusalem Bible, and I'll make sure of this because John usually comes to the Zoom class, the Jerusalem Bible has, what does this parrot wish to say? And the New English Bible has, what does this charlatan have to say? Because they just looked at it as, so they're basically writing him off as not a genuine philosopher. That's the first group. Whichever group they are. The second one said, as Cindy said a moment ago, he seems to be advocating foreign gods, which oddly, this was one of the charges brought against Socrates as bringing in religious innovations, and which caused him to be on trial and put to death. And Luke tells us why he seemed to be a preacher of foreign divinities. He explains that at the end of verse 18, because he was teaching about Jesus and the resurrection. The word for foreign there is xeno. you've probably heard of xenophobia, the fear of strangers, or xenophilo or philoxeno. Remember that word? Which is hospitality, the love of strangers. And so xeno is a common word for us. And so these were new gods to them. Never heard of Jesus. And in fact, some have suggested that they thought that when Paul said he's preaching about Jesus and the resurrection, that they were actually viewing it as two gods, that the male god was Jesus and that his female cohort, one is Anastasis, which was new life. So he had a male and a female gods, and that's why they were saying gods, because they were viewing it as being two different ones. So I think that it's interesting then that the conclusions of these pagans to Paul, of pagans to Paul in general, in Lystra, what did they see in Paul and Barnabas?
Isn't that where they saw them as God?
Yeah, they saw two old gods. They saw Zeus and Mercury. And so they had two, or Zeus and Hermes. In Athens, they saw two new gods. Which is kind of it's just fascinating to me that your audience is going to see different things no matter what you do. You can preach the same message and you'll get different reactions to it from different people. Regardless of their motive, regardless of their opinions about what Paul said, they're now going to bring him to the meeting at the Areopagus. And that takes us to question 12. Any comments about Stoics and Epicureans and all of that? So in verse 19, it says, they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, may we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting. Now, this is where I want Cindy to read in the King James Version, verse 19.
And they took him and brought him unto the
You have Areopagus there?
Yes.
So you don't have an original King James Version. I'm sorry. Yeah, I can't believe that you have a brand new version of that. How dare you? Do you have Hill of Ares or Hill of Mars anywhere in that text?
Yes, on the side of Mars Hill.
Where is that?
It's just on the side of
Oh, it has it on the side. Okay. The original King James had it in the text. So they've apparently improved that. Because Areopagus simply does mean that. It means the Hill of Ares. You don't see the word Mars in there. You see Ares because this is Greek. Mars was the Roman equivalent of Ares, or the closest equivalent, which is why the Romans called this place Mars Hill. The Greeks called it the Areopagus. And I have it in here as it is in the older King James Version. I'm just hoping you had an old one, but you did. So.
I wonder why when they translated English, they just didn't put that for us.
Well, and it's interesting, as you study, you're going to find sometimes where they're going to translate a word, give you the meaning of the word, and sometimes they're going to give you a different thing. So, like in 1 John chapter, or it is only one chapter, in 2 John, verse 1, it says, the elders of the elect city and her children. And so there's a name there, and I don't have it here in front of me. That's a name. I think it's that John is writing to a woman whose name translates out to elect lady. And you can see parents in their name, they got their daughter, and isn't she she's like a chosen lady. And so they named her this beautiful name, and now we've taken that name and translated it and tried to make it into a church, that he's writing to a church. But I think he's writing to an individual woman. It would be like writing to me and say, we saw God as my judge today at the church, and taking my name, Daniel, and translating it into what it means rather than looking at it as a name. And so Areopagus is what it came to be known. That was the name of it. And you can go ahead and translate it out, but it's going to be the same. Did you have a comment? Oh, Tim.
Not being a philosopher that thinking these things, but more pragmatic, I'm wondering, you know, we just talked about having slaves. Where's their wealth that they can sit around and not do anything?
They were probably free men who had slaves who were doing all the work for them. So they didn't have to labor. They were men of leisure. That was the beauty of having that. Okay? Over time, the name of the place became the name of the council, because the Areopagus became the name of the council that met on Mars Hill. It's like if you're reading a newspaper tomorrow and you say, word came down from the Hill, what would you say? Who's it talking about? Congress. Talking about Congress. And we call it the Hill because that's where Congress meets. But now it has become, by metonymy, the name of, and equals the Congress. So what did the Areopagus look like? That's what it looks like today. It's a big rock, and there is you can see there's stairs that come up here to get to the top up here, and it's kind of flat going back this direction. I think that if you look down this direction, I think it's down this direction that you would see the agora, and I could be just exactly wrong about that. Yes. Pardon me?
The market is, if I'm looking at it, the market is to the right.
Okay. So you've been there? Oh, wonderful. One of these days, maybe me too. Okay. Yeah.
Jackie went there and she couldn't get over the fact that she stood there where Paul.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, most of the time, this is the picture of the Areopagus that you're going to see in Bibles and paintings, and you can see the columns and like it's a building where they are at. And so I say, no. You like that? Crossed it out. Because that's probably what it looked like then too. Just a flat rock. There was no building on there. They just met out in the open here. And so while I showed you that it looks like today, pretty much looks like that then too. It wasn't any difference.
I think they would have gone up there and taken him there to get away from the marketplace and the rabble and
Yeah.
all the stuff that was going, so they could just have their own time.
Right. Well, and you got a good view of the city from up there. So it would have been a nice place. Sometime about 400 or 500 years before Paul, it was where the court tried serious cases. This was before democracy came to Greece, certainly before the Romans. And in Paul's day, there was still a council that met there on this rock, made up of Athenian thinkers and leaders. If you were a member of the Areopagus, you were Archon, A-R-C-H-O-N, you were that for life. And mainly now at this point in time in the Areopagus, they are defending the concept of the gods. So it's almost there was not much difference in the politics and religious aspects of their lives. And while they were still involved, from what I can understand, involved in criminal trials, prosecution does not seem to be the purpose that they brought Paul up here. They're not trying to prosecute him over his new teachings. He's here as a result of their interest in what he's saying, not hostility to what he is saying.
So trials were no longer took place there, was basically.
Occasionally they were. What I've been able to find out, there were occasional trials there, but that's not really the point of it anymore. And it's interesting because what he says here does not really address either Epicurean or Stoic philosophy. He's addressing the whole audience, all of these people that have followed him up here from the Agora, the interested people that were listening to all of these debates. They're all up there massed around him as well. They would have been men who made up the council regardless of their philosophical bent, and the crowds that no doubt followed him up there. In other words, what you have here is a grand opportunity for Paul to introduce God and Jesus to all of them by invitation, and without any kind of hostility against him. He's just going to be able to just present the truth to them.
And does that mean that they all spoke the same language?
They all spoke Greek. Yeah. Yeah, Greek is the universal language. Everybody speaks Greek. If you lived in Judea, you're also going to speak Aramean. If you lived in Rome, you're also going to speak Latin.
It wasn't necessary for Paul to speak in tongues.
No, they're all going to speak Greek. All right. So, we're going to be on this question for a while. List the main points of Paul's sermon. So, Paul stood up in the midst of the Areopagus, and I just want you to try to put yourself in Paul's shoes, how dramatic a moment this is going to be, because he knows the gravity of the situation. He knows the opportunity that's being presented to him here, that's been given to him. And I think while he may have wished that Timothy and Silas were there with him at this time, every eye is on him. Everybody that's there is from Greece probably, and there's not going to be another time when there's going to be an audience like this. Yes, Randy.
Just before you get into what he actually says, it's kind of easy to look at the last couple verses there from 18 through 21 and kind of, I don't know, write off their motive. You know, it was more of a novelty than genuine interest in what he had to say.
Right.
But when you look at the end, it says that some believe. So evidently there were some there that
Yeah.
that the message of the gospel touched their heart.
Right.
But they may not have entered into listening to it
With thinking that was going to happen.
right.
Right. And I think that probably happens a lot. You know, you get a chance to share the gospel with somebody, they're not really sure, you know, what they're getting into, and then all of a sudden it really strikes a chord with them that they didn't even know they had in their heart to be struck. Yeah, you do have that, you know, may we know what this new teaching is. There were some people that wanted to know more about it. Roger?
Yeah, there are people that set out to prove the Bible wrong.
Oh, yeah?
Change their mind, but I was looking at the last part of 21, and the foreigners who live there, who spent their time with nothing except telling or hearing something new, put them in the same category as a babbler that they call Paul, isn't it? I mean, that was in the same.
Well, yeah, I mean, they're making a judgment. It was, what Paul was saying was new, and then they made a judgment about what he was showing that was new, and so they would go to the next new guy. Oh, that's not very interesting, and they'd go to a next new guy. But, you know, that kind of gets back to Tim's point here, how they spent their time doing nothing else but that, you know, so apparently they had businesses that other people were running for them so they could survive and make their living. I think Paul, he just went to the Agora, he's teaching, you know, and then this just grew and blossomed, and now here he is in an amazing public facility, being given the opportunity to share the gospel with people, and without any real overt activity on his part. So the introduction is in verses 22 and 23, and what does he say? The introduction to this lesson.
That's where the hook is. He's going to tie it to something they're familiar with,
Okay?
and at the same time introduce what he's about to tell them.
Okay. Did you have another comment you want to make on that?
They have a religious nature / culture, but it's an ignorance.
Okay. Yeah. His text was one of is actually, if you're going to say, what's your text? Well, it's one of the idols that he saw. That's his text. Debbie?
But he also did it with care.
Yeah.
He was very positive
Right. Right.
Take them back.
And you know, we read, I perceive that my old translation, I think the American Standard Version had, that in every way you are very superstitious. How do we view somebody who's superstitious today? Do we think that they're intelligent and right in their mind, or if they have kind of an oddity about them that they won't walk under ladders and they get tired, get all caught up in things if a black cat runs in front of them and, you know, throwing salt over their shoulders? I mean, so superstitious isn't really a good word for us. That gives a bad connotation. They're religious. That's what he's saying. They're very religious. And he said, I noticed that you seem to be, and actually, if you translate it out literally, you are unusually devoted to divinities. All of these gods. And he said, and then there was one that caught my eye. As I was walking through the city, I saw an altar inscribed to who? The unknown God. And if that's in the Greek, it's agnosto theo. Theo is God. And you know what agnostic is? Someone who says they don't know. No, they don't say there's no God. I don't know if there's a God or not. They're ignorant. And so this is a God that's unknown or unknowable. And so they had, I told you what, 30,000 idols? What if there's 30,001? We don't want to make that God mad. And so we have an altar to the one we don't know. It's not our fault. He's either unknown or unknowable. And so they had this altar. A traveler there's a document that dates to 175 AD. So that's 120 years after Paul's situation here. And he wrote about the fact that this altar still existed there in Athens. This altar to an unknown God was still there over 100 years later. So Paul's approach here is based on their ignorance. If they're wanting to know new things, then the worst thing for them would be to be ignorant. And so he's going to say, I'll tell you about that God. Let me tell you about him. What you worship as something unknown, I'm going to proclaim to you. I'm going to enlighten you so that you won't be ignorant anymore. Well, they would be slurping that up. That's going to be great. So what's his first point in verse 24?
God made the world and all things.
Okay, so there is a God. This God that you worship as unknown is the God who created everything. So that's completely different from the Epicureans' view that chance is behind all creation, and also different from the Stoics, who believe that God was in the creation. The creation was God. So instead, he's presenting God as a personal creation and the personal Lord over all that he created. And based on that, as he says there, he does not live in temples made by hands. If you're talking about this God who's the creator of everything and he's the Lord over everything, it's absurd to think that he would dwell in something that you made. And, you know, they think about that. Well, you're right. Of course that's. So his second point is in verse 25, and what's that?
He's not served by human hands,
Keep going.
as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything.
Okay, so this God who created everything, is the Lord of everything, also is the sustainer of life. The life God created is also sustained by his power. He gives life and breath. So bringing him food and drink, like he's some sort of domesticated pet, you know, that we're feeding him and making sure he has food and water and wine and all of that. He obviously does not need us to sustain him. Okay? The third point is in verses 26 through the first part of verse 28. And what would that be?
We're all made of one blood, and that we can find him.
Okay? So if I take all of that down into one phrase, he's the ruler of the nations. That God is the ruler of all the nations. From one blood, from one man, I should say. The word blood is not in the Greek. It's from one man. God created everything. And so if you have in verse 26 that he made from one blood every nation, it is actually one man. And who is that one man that he made everybody from? Adam. And if you go to the second one, it would be Noah. But Adam is the one that he has in mind here. And it's from that one person all the nations have come forth. And it was his purpose for mankind, it was his purpose for humanity, that they should inhabit all the earth. That's in Genesis chapter 1. Be fruitful and multiply and do what? Fill the earth. It's right there. And so God created the earth for man to inhabit. He established the seasons and the borders of those nations. So being created in his image, which really isn't mentioned in his text here, they would naturally seek him. They would perhaps reach out and feel for him. The feel here is P-S-E-L-A-P-H-A-O, Pselaphaho. It's a word that we get the word palpate from. You ever had a doctor palpate your ribs or see if you're, is this broken? Let me tell you, oops. This is broken now. And so that's what it means. And it has actually the picture of a blind man who's fumbling and trying to feel for something. God hasn't moved. He's always been in the same place. Isaiah 59, 1 and 2 says what? Your sins have separated you from your God, so that you cannot touch him. We're the ones that moved. God stayed in the same place. But that, again, that sin made him distant and made him unknown, which made me think of another place where Paul wrote to pagans or about pagans in Romans chapter 1. Was that the first bell? Yes. Thank you. In Romans chapter 1 and at verses, I won't read the whole thing. I'll give you the text, verses 26 through 28. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions, especially verse 28. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them over up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. Verse 21, going back there, for although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give him thanks. And basically what you had with what was happening there with the Gentiles is they don't have God. They didn't want to know about him. So they turned away from him. We don't want to have anything to do with you. And that's why he seems so far away. But Paul here goes on and says, but really, he's not far from us. He's still there. Verse 28, for in him we live and move and have our being. By the way, that is a quotation from a 6th century BC poet, Epimedes of Crete. So Paul is quoting a poet that they would be familiar with in saying that. Go ahead, Randy.
I was just thinking about the groping part that you mentioned. It was translated grope beforehand.
Right.
And for what the other translations say. Feel beforehand?
Yes. Well, that they should seek and perhaps feel their way toward him, yeah.
But just the image you had of a blind person,
Right.
or if you're in the dark and trying to find something, it just reminded me of all the other things that Paul has taught, and even Peter. Paul teaches in Colossians that he has translated out of darkness
Right.
into the kingdom of the Son of his love.
Right.
And Jesus is the light. I mean, just there's all these things that
Right.
I just didn't see that.
Right. Right. Isn't it in the Gospel of John where he says that but men love the darkness rather than the light?
Well, that's John.
Okay.
John the Baptist.
Yeah.
Talking about Jesus. But then Peter talks about called us out of darkness.
Right.
into his marvelous light.
Right.
But anyway, I think you can kind of see that wrapped up in what he's saying there.
Exactly.
Come out and say that, but that imagery really.
Well, and again, when we talk about ignorance, we tell people they're in the dark. So come to the, and knowledge is always coming to the light. And so he's just adding to that there. And Mike's getting ready to go push the button. So we have a fourth point in this lesson, and then a fifth point. The fourth point, by the way, I'll just tell you where it is in the latter part of verse 28 and verse 29. And the fifth and final point is in verses 30 and 31. And we will cover those next week. This is a masterful speech. And Luke has just, and I hadn't thought about this before, but Luke's just giving us the highlights here. You can read this whole text in 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes. I promise you, Paul didn't just talk for 2 minutes. He had a lot more to say. And so Luke is just giving us the main points, and I'm sure that he elaborated all about that. People say, well, you know, Paul, he didn't mention Jesus, he didn't talk about the resurrection and all of this. Listen, the reason he's there is because he was preaching about Jesus and the resurrection in the Agora, and so I'm sure that he brought that up here to the point, as Randy pointed out before, when he gets done, there's people that are ready to, they believe it. They're ready to follow him. So there's more to his speech, more to his teaching here than what we're getting. We're getting enough to be in awe of it, but there's much more there. Okay? All right, well, thank you very much.